We're back in dealing with the book that Jean and Jennefer have written, Reshaping Toronto's Waterfront, moving closer to the modern period. And in 1992, there was a Royal Commission, and that's what moved us away ultimately from the Harbour Commission model. But the Royal Commission heralded a new environmentally based planning, which they called the ecosystem approach. What did the ecosystem approach mean?
Well, this was an approach to waterfront planning that the Commission kind of came up with. It was a concept that the Commission developed, and it was largely influenced by sort of the environmental politics of the times. In conceptual terms, the ecosystem approach is an approach to waterfront planning that privileges the connections and relationships between the economy, society, and the environment. It's that kind of win-win-win that if we resolve that we have to take the impact of development on all of those factors or aspects of life into account when we're doing development. So it proposes, for example, that you can't look at the development on the waterfront without looking at the impacts that development might have on other areas that are, for example, ecologically connected to the waterfront, like the upper reaches of the river watersheds, for example, or vice versa, the impact of the headlands on the waterfront.
To a lefty like me, that sounds like an incredibly progressive development model. But I know the book argues that actually the ecological approach, well, it may be all of that. The trust actually resolved some historic problems that had hampered the development of Toronto's waterfront. And in the book, you write, Toronto's green consensus, insofar as it relates to the politics of development, may have been achieved not as a result of Toronto's conservative elites leaving their environmental flank unprotected, but rather the argument is that the ecosystem approach could be an explicit growth-oriented strategy as well. That seems contradictory on its face. I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more, about how the ecosystem approach was able to resolve those old historic problems.
Yeah, in that chapter we argue that the ecosystem approach was a way of achieving an accommodation between a variety of players that are often thought of as being at odds, like you said. So notably between environmentalists and proponents of urban economic development.
One of the attributes of this is that the words are very plastic. So
that's very true.
Ecosystem, like sustainability, can mean an enormous number of things to people.
Just like with the word nature. It's, I guess, one of the things that we need to take into consideration is that the Royal Commission was happening at a time when there was what people call a second green wave of environmental politics, that issues of environment were very much at the forefront of sort of public issues at the time. And that green wave, that environmentalism in that period was distinguished from the first one by a number of things, one of which was that it took what people call a conciliatory approach to capital. So it was looking at resolving environmental issues through things like market mechanisms, financial mechanisms, to achieve this kind of win-win-win. If we win for the environment, then we can win for the economy. And with the ecosystem approach, we also win for society. Whether or not that's actually the case is a question. Whether or not we're compromising some set of principles for another set of principles is a big question. But that's how the ecosystem approach or those resolutions were characterized, the win-win-win characterization. So, as you say, we had this odd kind of proposal that urban development on the waterfront could actually resolve environmental issues. That and the thinking goes, the logic goes, and it's pretty much very well understood and accepted now, but it was quite revolutionary at its time. The thinking was that if we build up, then we don't have to build out. So that resolves issues of urban, and also if we build in the center of the city, which is where the waterfront is. So that would resolve issues like less farmland would have to be used, there would be less urban sprawl, and society comes in to play with lower issues around the societal impacts come into play with lower commuting times for people. There's less smog. Fewer children get asthma. So building on the waterfront becomes conceptualized as resolving a variety of environmental and social problems that don't necessarily originate on the waterfront, but that are broader social and environmental problems in the urban area.
And this really, I think, hopeful and, as you said, for its time, revolutionary approach is the approach that the Waterfront Trust, which was led originally by David Crombie, followed. But as with a lot of these stories, within 10 years, the language of the ecosystem approach had really, it was dead. It had been replaced, and the Toronto Waterfront Trust had been replaced by the Toronto Waterfront Revitalization Corporation. And the Revitalization Corporation has switched its language to a global imperative model that really focused on economic benefits. And so I guess the question is, why did the ecosystem model die so easily, or did it die? Is it still hiding there underneath, but now clothed in more economic language as opposed to some of the explicitly environmental language?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. In this race to create a world city, a lot of the language was around, we have to be a world city and we need to redevelop our waterfront so that we can compete with the elites of global cities. There's an underlying kind of strain of sustainability. In order to compete properly, we have to give people a good quality of life, and a good quality of life is dependent on a healthy ecosystem.
Right.
So that's kind of where the two come together. They're not unrelated.
Right. Sustainability is a key concept in a lot of Waterfront Toronto's development projects, and they have a sustainability program. And they have various kinds of LEEDs.
The LEED certification process for buildings so that they're environmentally friendly.
Buildings have LEEDs certification, right?
And I do know that at least the new Sherbourne Common that has recently been completed integrated rainwater management together with the more common aspects of a park that we think of, the water features.
It's a win-win.
Or a lose-lose, I'm not sure.
It depends. Yeah.
Well, I for one aesthetically love the new Sherbourne Common.
Okay.
So I'm going to put my vote on the yes side.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know that there are many who don't agree with me. I was struck, though, and I think certainly anyone who has followed the politics of the waterfront in the last 5 or 6 years as we've tried to move forward in the Waterfront Corporation and their different levels of government have come in with funding. But I was struck, and it's on page 263 of your book, Reshaping Toronto's Waterfront, but it's actually a quote from Christopher Hume. And Mr. Hume asked quite simply, who is in charge? Is it the Toronto Waterfront Revitalization Corporation? Is it the landowners? Is it the city? Is it the province? Is it nobody? Is it everybody? And I think you can get that sense with some of the disputes that have taken place on the waterfront. And when you look at it, what's the answer to Christopher's question?
Well, it's a really good question, and it's not an easy question to answer. At any particular period of time, we could say there's a dominant agency in charge, but things change, and particularly now we hear rumblings from the new regime in City Hall that there needs to be a change in the governance of the waterfront. But at the moment, or at least until quite recently, Waterfront Toronto had much of the responsibility for waterfront development, and Waterfront Toronto emerged out of some of the plans for the Toronto Olympic Games, the bids for those Olympic Games, and it's a joint venture between the city and the province and the government of Ontario, the federal government. Each level of government has committed itself to providing about $500 million for funding of planning and development of the waterfront. And most of Waterfront Toronto's projects are oriented towards infrastructure development. like the berm or like the Sherburne Common.
And sorry, I'm just going to jump in and say that in much of the literature, you'll see that this kind of infrastructure is called green infrastructure, which is very interesting.
Yeah. And the business model of Waterfront Toronto is based on those investing in those infrastructure projects, and they presumably or intentionally will create a market for waterfront lands. And then the return to that investment will be repaid by Waterfront Toronto selling its publicly owned waterfront land. And that publicly owned waterfront land will have increased in value because of all those waterfront improvements, infrastructure improvements. But Mayor Ford now, he's questioning whether or not the public sector should be involved in waterfront development at all. In effect, what he's saying is that waterfront development is much more efficiently and effectively practiced by the private sector and not by the public sector, and therefore the city government should get out of waterfront development entirely.
Should just get out of the way and let the private sector do its thing.
But I think that both Jennefer and I disagree fundamentally with that approach. And I think that the majority of Torontonians also would object to that, because there is a very, very strong tradition of citizen participation in all kinds of development and planning activities in the city.
And that's really what's happened over the last many years with Waterfront Toronto, that citizens have kind of stepped up to the plate and said, hey, we want to have a say in this development situation, and there's been a lot of input into the planning processes. So, changing gears at this point is a pretty fundamental change to be making.
Well, it does bring us back, as you said, to the big public good discussions.
That's right.
And the disaster that is that wall of condos at the foot of Bay Street, notwithstanding, as the counterpoint to Mayor Ford's argument that private development can produce something meaningful for the city.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The follow-up, I guess, that I would ask is from the purely economic point of view. I'm a sort of admitted lefty. Anyone who listens to the show knows where my views are. But the counterpoint...
Anybody who took my courses would have similar opinions about me. No.
But the counterpoint, I think, just to the proposals that are coming out of the mayor's office, and I heard a little bit of it, but I'd like you to expand on it if you could, is the value of that property. If we sell it without these improvements, the berm, I mean, which I guess is done, but Sherburne Common, the other improvements, if we try to sell this land now before the infrastructure is there, the argument I hear is that you're going to get such a low value for it compared to the value that you could get in the future, that even without making the public good argument, which should be made, but even without that, that actually Mayor Ford's plan is going to really leave the city with very little money in terms of the actual value of that asset.
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, the whole, as Jean was saying, the whole model is based on you make public investments into green infrastructure, into improving the infrastructure in the area, and the land value goes up, and so eventually you can realize a much larger economic benefit to the city than you would by just selling it off now.
Yeah, I think unimproved waterfront land, like there's a lot of it in the Port Industrial District, that doesn't have, a lot of it doesn't have sewage facilities or adequate water and electrical facilities, and certainly not adequate road or public transit facilities.
To say nothing, sorry.
Yeah, to sell it off now would be ridiculous.
And to say nothing of the environmental contamination that's on a lot of the lands because of industrial uses over the last many.
Yeah. So who's going to pay for cleaning up of the land?
I mean, we could have a debate over whether the private sector should be cleaning up its own mess in the first place, but at this point, the public sector is stepping in and making those investments to clean up the lands that will eventually, result in a larger economic benefit to the city.
Yeah, my argument with Waterfront Toronto, also with Ford, but also primarily with Waterfront Toronto, is I don't think public waterfront land should be sold to the public sector. I think the waterfront private sector. I think that the waterfront land should remain with the public sector.
Well, I think there's certainly a strong argument for that it's a public good and a public benefit that needs to be distributed. But I guess this brings us back to another theme, and I'm going to change gears on you a little bit. But that theme that everything old is new again.
Yep.
And there's an essay in the book that deals with the Depression era and the use of the Don River Valley, which isn't exactly the waterfront, but the Don is so intimately connected. And it's a story that I had never heard. I've lived now in Toronto for probably about 15 years now, and I'd never heard this story, although I'm fond of going out to the farmers market that they host at the old Don Brickworks site. But at that brickwork site during the worst of the Depression, there were upwards of 100 men sleeping, according to the essay, in the actual brick kilns. And that's, for listeners who it doesn't add up, the bricks at that time, took a week or even more to cool and harden to where they could be used. And the men found that they could come in as the bricks were drying, get the heat from the bricks to have a place to sleep that was safer and warmer. And the part of the story that was actually quite surprising to me or counterintuitive was that the management, the general manager at the brickworks, had reached out, had said that the men who had found themselves in this situation were invited guests and actually resisted attempts of the Toronto police or the sheriff or others to come in and move these men on. He really resisted those forces and instructed his employees to resist those forces. The story, of course, ends as so many of these stories do. The mayors of Toronto and East York became concerned not only at the number of men living in the brickworks, but living in the Don River Valley, completely concerned that they were communist agitators, as was a common refrain during the Depression, that poverty, of course, would make you a rebellious force, and that they needed to be moved along. And ultimately, many of the men were drafted by the province to be put to work building the Trans-Canada Highway in northern Ontario. But what struck me as I read it, first, just the interesting story, but secondly, then I thought of the current situation we have at City Hall right now. We have councillors saying that panhandling needs to be outlawed because I guess that will do away with people needing money. And in fact, Councillor Mamalidi going even further and suggesting that homeless people should be forcibly relocated by the police off the streets. Now, he's not suggesting a return to the vagrancy laws where people would be put in jail for not having enough money in their pocket, but he is suggesting that the police should have the power to forcibly relocate anyone who's homeless to a hospital or some other location, whether they wish it or not. And that story just struck me because it was so much the arguments of the Depression are the arguments of today and the way that repeats itself. But I just wanted to ask each of you, because you've looked at this segment of land and this period so closely, what themes do you feel are the most repeated themes along Toronto's waterfront? Those themes that just don't go away, the disputes that seem to be settled and just keep coming back and coming back.
Yeah, first I'd like to mention that the chapter that you were talking about, the kind of social history of the Don River, was written by Jennefer Bonnell, and Jennefer recently got her PhD from Boise and now has a postdoctoral fellowship. And she's been a great student of the waterfront and made a major contribution to our book, and original contribution. And I think that chapter is really great. But yes, we do see that we're recycling our political debates and things. The structure, maybe the structure or organization of political struggle continues, and we think, the way I see it, there are really three big issues that keep repeating themselves, or three themes, and some of this appears in the book. One of them is the governance question. How do you govern the waterfront, and who governs the waterfront? And that's all about who has power to make decisions. The other question or theme that keeps repeating itself is, what should the waterfront be used for? Questions of land use. Should the port have dominance, or should the urban kind of activities have dominance? And there's an ongoing struggle about what should be the predominant uses of the waterfront. And then the third one that I particularly like to mention is the relationships with nature. For example, should there be hard edges on the waterfront like we saw that were built during the industrial period with the great breakwalls that surround all the port industrial districts, or should there be soft edges? Should there be improvement to nature, or should there be sustainability? And I think those kinds of questions, relationships between nature and society, keep repeating themselves over and over again. The most recent plans for the Don River that were approved a couple of years ago, but we're not sure exactly what's going to happen to them now, by Michael von Valkenburg, who is the head of landscape architecture at Harvard. And he suggested that the urban estuary be a concept that can reinvent the mouth of the Don River. And there's a new kind of relationship between society and nature, which is being proposed within that plan.
We only have about 5 minutes left, so I'm gonna ask my next 3 questions all at once, and then give you each a chance, because I really wanna hear from you. I think it's a real treat to have 2 students of the history of the waterfront that have looked at the past 150 years. But so the questions are this, and then I'll let you both finish off. What do you think is actually going to happen in the next 50 years, having looked at the last 150-year history? And what is your biggest fear as the redevelopment moves forward, that it could go in a direction that won't be healthy or sustainable or good for Torontoan? And the last one, because I think it's good to end on an optimistic note, what is your greatest hope we can do with our waterfront to really place Toronto in a great place in 50 years from now?
Okay.
I guess first, in terms of what the next 50 years holds, not to give a sort of a trite answer, but one of the themes in our book, as you say, and as we've been talking about, is that change happens. So there's going to be continued change on the waterfront. And most particularly, there's going to be continued political struggle on the waterfront over who gets to decide and what the shape of the waterfront is going to be. And, it may, despite the fact that the Waterfront Corporation has got a variety of plans that have been approved, you don't necessarily, things aren't necessarily settled in the realm of urban development politics. In terms of biggest fears, I'd say that, for me anyway, my biggest fear is that the waterfront becomes kind of an enclave for the privileged, that the waterfront is, that folks who are systematically excluded from society also become excluded from the waterfront. And we need to take active steps in urban development to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I would. I agree about the future. I think that there's going to be continued change, and we have to be involved. I think it's important to be involved in those processes of change.
Yeah.
My greatest fear is that we're going to be selling off public waterfront lands, because once the waterfront lands become sold, they don't return to the public realm. In terms of my greatest hope, I think that the establishment of a planning and development process that has social and environmental justice as its principal operating concern, that's what I see as my greatest hope for the waterfront.
And I hope that there's enough housing that's built on the waterfront that's affordable for people who need it, and that the waterfront is accessible, and that there are a range of activities, including economic diversity.
Healthy ecosystems.
And healthy ecosystems is going to have to be our last word. But I really want to thank Jean Desfor and Jennefer Laidley for joining me. Their book is Reshaping Toronto's Waterfront. And if you're out there and you're anyone who has an interest in the future of Toronto's waterfront, I highly recommend. They've edited this volume. There's wonderful essays in there, and it'll really give you a sense of where we've come from. And I think if you want to make a contribution and have something to say about where we should go, it's very important to know where we've come from. I was at a cottage with some friends last week. I sat on the dock with this book, and it was a wonderful read, and I can't recommend it any more highly. I think you should go out and pick it up. Thank you so much for joining us.